Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Nigeria was supposed to be Africa's powerhouse. Its vast population, cultural influence, and oil reserves seemed to set it up with a chance to be a big player among the world's major economies. But now it's facing what some are calling the biggest economic crisis in a generation, and a government that is failing to meet its country's basic needs. With the world turning increasingly away from fossil fuels, did Nigeria get too hooked on oil?
I have consistently maintained the position that the fuel subsidy had to go. This once beneficial measure had outlived its usefulness. Our economy is going through a tough patch.
A year into the presidency of Bola Tinubu, we're asking if reforms that he's tried to implement can help turn the country around, or whether they're making things worse for everyday Nigerians on the ground. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Bloomberg's Nduka Orjinmo has been working on this story, and he's joining us now from Abuja. Nduka, thank you so much for joining us. And really great story for everybody who hasn't taken a look at it. They should. So let's just start with President Tinubu, because this is really sort of the crux of the story here and what's happened since he was elected a little over a year ago now. Talk to us about who he is and how Nigeria was faring when he was elected last year.
Well, he's a former two-time governor of Lagos State. Lagos State is Nigeria's commercial capital, the richest state in the country, the most populous city in West Africa. And he was elected on the back of what he did in Lagos. He improved infrastructure. He tripled the internally generated revenue in the state. And when he contested last year in the election, he came in on that promise of turning Nigeria around, as he did in Lagos during his time as governor. He was instrumental, Tinubu, in the formation of the All Progressives Congress, that's his party, in 2013. And when the party came into power in 2015, he was elected as the de facto leader of the party. Nigeria was in a difficult place when he took over. We had inflation that was in double digits already. We had, more especially, an economy that was struggling with very high budget deficits. You had declining crude production, which is a big problem. And so he came in promising to fix that. And Mr. Tinubu knew exactly what he was getting into, because he admitted that these challenges were there and that he was going to fix them.
So then, Nduka, let's just get into some of the challenges then. What is it actually looking like, though, on the ground for everyday Nigerians?
Most Nigerians will tell you that they are facing the most difficult periods of their lives. And if you look at the data, it backs it up. Inflation is at a 3-decade high. The last time Nigeria experienced such a high level of inflation rate was in the mid-90s, when you still had the military rule here in Nigeria. You have Nigerians who are already spending around 60% of their income on food alone, now having to spend far more just to survive. And we've seen the consequences of that. Earlier this year, we saw hungry people, raiding warehouses where grains were kept, and the army had to be called in to protect those warehouses. We saw a stampede in Lagos, people queuing up to get food, and a couple of people died there. And so things are quite dire on the ground now. So people have gone through this very difficult period of high inflation rates, and they've not really seen their wages increase to keep up with that.
Do people blame President Tinubu for this? I mean, he's only been in an office just over a year. And if you think about it, he's also from the same party as President Buhari, who was his predecessor. Who are people sort of pointing the finger at?
They blame him partly because this is his party. This party has been in power since 2015. And he was instrumental in the emergence of former President Muhammadu Buhari in 2015. So many Nigerians feel that he's part of this face this problem we people are passing through now. There are those also who are a little bit fair to him, and they've said, look, this man has only been in power for just over a year, and the challenges he met are not of his own making. And he even said that when he was campaigning that he's going to be his own man. He wasn't going to take the responsibility for the problems, challenges created by his party and by his predecessor. He's walked back on some of the policies of the previous government, and he's made that clear that some of those policies did not work. Two key policies, especially two big reforms, have defined his government so far. When he came in last year at the end of May, he announced during his inauguration that fuel subsidy was gone. And you have to understand, Jen, that Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer. However, we don't have local refineries here in Nigeria. So you have Africa's largest oil producer importing all of his refined fuel. But government then subsidizes this imported fuel by as much as $10 billion in 2022. And that's huge. That's money that could have been spent on education, money that could have been spent on building hospitals, money that could have been spent on building roads. And once Tinubu came in, he stopped that. I'll come back to this later, Jen, just to say that he's had challenges and that has had to be reintroduced. That was one policy. The second policy was the exchange rate. And that was a big problem for businesses in Nigeria. So what you had during the former regime of President Buhari was different exchange rates. You had one for certain importers that were close to the government. You had one for those who were trying to pay school fees for their children abroad, those who are going abroad for healthcare services. And these multiple exchange rates, it created a situation where there was round tripping and there was lots of arbitrage in the system. And once he came in, Tinubu, he also stopped that. So those were two key reforms of the previous administration that he stopped during his first month in office last year.
It's interesting because a lot of African leaders are facing this dilemma, right? Because they need to sort of contend with the economic situation that their country's in. But then they're also hearing it from everyday citizens, right? We're seeing that in Kenya similarly. But would you say the situation has just continued to get worse then, just given what you mentioned about the fuel subsidies, about the Naira sort of plunging? Have things gotten worse?
It depends on who you ask, Jen. You won't get a straightforward answer. Now, if you ask ordinary Nigerians who have been at the receiving end of inflation that spiked, triggered, of course, by what you've mentioned, the currency plunging, the currency has been devalued twice since June last year. If you ask those Nigerians who are having to grapple with this tough economic situation, they will say, look, things have gotten worse under President Tinubu. If you speak to foreign investors, and we've seen lots of portfolio inflows coming into Nigeria, they will say these reforms he's carried out are what they expected of him. The currency situation was such a nightmare for people to plan, volatility created. And, there are people who would say that has continued into his time. But we've seen some stability in recent times. We've seen the parallel exchange rate has almost equaled with the official exchange rate. And that will be counted as a win by the central bank and by this government. So it depends on who you're asking, Jen. Foreign investors, the IMF, the World Bank, they think the administration and the reforms carried out so far are on the right track. However, for ordinary Nigerians, they feel that this is the worst period of their lives.
And Nduka, stick with us. When we come back, we'll talk about how the largest oil producer in Africa, of course that's Nigeria, is still facing an energy crisis. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Nduka is still with me as we look at Nigeria and its economy as it faces what some are calling the worst economic crisis in a generation. So, Nduka, we were talking briefly about this before the break. Nigeria is the largest oil producer in Africa. You wouldn't know that, though, based on imports that you were just mentioning. It's also a member of OPEC. So why is the money not reaching the economy? What is the disconnect here?
It's a question that most Nigerians ask themselves every day, especially if you go to the Niger Delta, where you have these communities where the oil is sucked out from. Most of those communities are some of the poorest communities in the country, if not in Africa. So they live in that much wealth, but it doesn't trickle down to them. And it's a combination of several factors. The state-owned National Petroleum Company is one of the most opaque companies in the world. Its books are rarely open. It released its last audited accounts in 2022 after several years of not doing that. At the moment, for instance, Jen, no one knows the true state of the subsidy payments in Nigeria. We know for a fact that fuel gasoline prices have been capped since August last year. We don't know how the NNPC is doing that. The NNPC keeps insisting that it's no longer paying any subsidy on that. We know that it is not possible because crude is an international product, and we've seen the prices fluctuate in international markets, but it's remained stable here in Nigeria. So it means that the mass is not adding up. But the NNPC won't give you any answers to that. And it gives you a snapshot of how there is that lack of transparency and accountability in Nigeria's oil sector. And that has led to a lack of investment by the big oil companies.
So then, and Nduka, just to wrap up, I mean, when we look forward, I know it's hard to predict just given all of the moving parts that are happening right now, but what is the outlook, or maybe what is going to ultimately determine whether or not these reforms that President Tinubu is putting in place is actually going to start working? I mean, what is it that we need to pay attention to? Is it when people stop demonstrating? Is it when imports of oil go down? What would you say?
I think we have to look at the exchange rate. We have to pin this on some of the big reforms of this government. And two stand out so far. One, the free float of the Naira and allowing the currency here to trade at its true value. We have to see if the government at some point begins to defend that. And that would be an indication that it has then gone full circle on from where it started. At the moment, though, the signs look good. We've seen almost a merger. The difference is quite minimal now between the parallel market of the Naira's value on the street and what the CBN, the Central Bank of Nigeria, is selling officially. On that score, I would say the government is doing well so far. I think the next big thing, though, is inflation. We have to keep an eye on the inflation rate in Nigeria. It's quite high at the moment, and the CBN has made it clear that it's one big battle at the moment is making sure that inflation reduces. We feel it has peaked, and that's the indication we get from looking at the data. On the other hand, the big hurdle it needs to cross is subsidy payments and what it decides to do with that one. It's more of a political issue than it is an economic issue, because most Nigerians see that cheap fuel that they have to buy at the pumps as the only thing that they get from the government. And you don't blame some of them. Roads are in bad states, the hospitals are barely maintained, there are no good schools for their children. I don't think the government has the political will to let gasoline sell at its true value in Nigeria. We think at the moment, and the data supports it, that it's selling for around half its price. If it decides to sell it freely, I think we might see a Kenya-style protest sooner rather than later in Nigeria.
Right. We've seen in Kenya how the president has had to step to pressure from young people. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out in a country like Nigeria. Nduka, Orjinmo, incredible reporting. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
My pleasure, Jen. My pleasure.
And as Nduka mentioned, time will only tell whether Tinubu's reforms are actually bearing fruit. But if Kenya is any example, the president may not have much time to prove to Nigerians that the short-term pain is, in fact, for the long-term gain. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley. If you like the episode, don't forget to comment and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks as always for listening.